Good food is essential for our health. I think we know that. But also, a good diet can help aid our fitness trajectory. Well, thanks to our partners at NewsZest, we are getting scientific today, and I've come up to Sheffield Hallam University to speak to an expert in sports nutrition, and we're going to be delving into what foods can actually help our recovery. As athletes, we put so much emphasis on making sure we're well fueled for our training, but what about our recovery? You're probably aware that you've got recovery drinks, the importance of having rest, making sure you get those carbohydrates in after your training session, but could there be more to it than that? Well, the researchers here at Sheffield Hallam believe so. In fact, they've been looking into the effects of polyphenols on muscle recovery. Now, if I've lost you on that term, let me hand to an expert to explain what we're talking about.
So polyphenols are components of plant-based foods. So foods such as fruits, berries, cereals, grains, and even coffee, tea and red wine as drinks, they contain polyphenols. And polyphenols have been shown to reduce inflammation and actually enhance recovery from strenuous exercise.
Well, that was Mayur Ranchordas, a sports nutrition research scientist who specialises in researching food that can aid exercise performance. Now, we're getting sciencey, so I think it's time to head into the lab and find out more about polyphenols. I'm excited to be in a lab and do some science. Okay, I'm going to take these off now because I can't see that well and we're not doing anything that crazy. But before we get into the science, Mayur, I just want to sort of cover the importance of food in actual recovery, because we talked so much about all the other aspects, but yeah, where does food come into it?
Yeah, so we know that, after training, you've damaged muscle tissue, you've used up your fuel in your muscle, and you've lost a lot of sweat. So you have to replace all those components, and that's where food comes in.
Okay, and we know, I think, quite a lot about needing to get the protein in and the carbohydrates and those macronutrients, but what about the micronutrients? What do we need to be covering?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Most people focus on macros, don't they? So how much protein and carbohydrate do I need in my recovery? But micronutrients are equally as important. So, for example, we lose some magnesium in our sweat. We know that iron carries oxygen, so we have to make sure that we get plenty of iron in our diets. And importantly, one of the crucial aspects is polyphenols. And emerging evidence seems to show that it can have an effect to enhance recovery.
Now, I know, you touched on before we even spoke about this, that there's so many micronutrients, but it's polyphenols that you yourself have been doing that science on. What have you tested? What foods have you tested and found that actually are high in this?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So polyphenols is a really interesting emerging area of sports nutrition research. And there's a lot of evidence that shows foods like pomegranate, blueberries, bilberries, and even cherries. And all these berry-type foods contain high levels of polyphenols. And most of the studies have basically found that when you take these polyphenols after exercise, it can help reduce your muscle soreness, it can help reduce inflammation, and these are all aspects that can help you recover quicker, because if you can recover quicker, you can train more.
Yeah, an essential part. And I know you've done some work with NewsZest and their Good Green Vitality, but how did that come about, and how have you actually done this research? I'm intrigued of the science aspect here. Yeah,
really interesting. So we talked about the various different fruits, pomegranate, bilberry, cocoa. And interestingly, NewsZest, the GGV that NewsZest do, contain all these compounds. So we tested GGV in the lab, and we tested the product for the amount of polyphenols it contains. And interestingly, one serving of NewsZest has the same amount of polyphenols as a really large handful of blueberries.
Okay.
So, it's a really important aspect of recovery, as we've discussed. And if you can add a scoop of GGV into your recovery drinks, that can really elevate the polyphenol content.
Well, I know this whole video today, we're looking at recovery and, polyphenols are helping recovery. So does that mean that we just always take them after exercise, I presume, or we eat our blueberries after exercise?
Yeah, well, naturally you'd think that, wouldn't you, that you want to recover quicker, so you take your polyphenols after exercise. But actually the evidence suggests that for recovery purposes, you need around 1,000 milligrams of polyphenols.
Right.
Well, it's really difficult to take that amount of polyphenols in one sitting. So what a lot of the researchers has shown is that if you take it several times throughout the day, and you take it for several days, then that is probably the best way to enhance your recovery.
Okay.
So for example, in the morning with your breakfast, you might have a smoothie with a lot of blueberries and raspberries. And then with your recovery, you might have, let's say having a yogurt for dessert, you might put a few more berries in there, some pomegranates, and then you might have a scoop of GGV, for example, for another 200 milligrams of polyphenols. Okay. So you're staggering them throughout the day.
Yeah, right. If you're sprinkling it throughout the day and we're trying to get this 1,000 milligrams, how does that actually look in real food? Like what is a handful of blueberries?
Yeah, so different fruits have different amounts of polyphenols, but the way to think about it is if you've got a large handful of blueberries, you're kind of hitting around the 150, 200 milligrams of polyphenols, obviously depending on where they're from, how they were grown.
Yeah.
And this is the difficulty because you don't know how much polyphenol is in the food. But we haven't mentioned coffee. So coffee contains polyphenols.
Oh, I've had my polyphenols for the day.
So if you have several cups of coffee a day, you're around the 250 milligrams. Okay. You have a handful of blueberries, handful of raspberries, some pomegranate. All of a sudden, you're really approaching that 1,000 milligrams.
And how good does our body actually absorb and use all those polyphenols that we take in, or is some of it lost? How efficient is our body at taking on what X amount that you've tested in those blueberries or found in the coffee? Do we get all of that?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think the jury's still out. We don't necessarily know enough about how polyphenols are absorbed, how much you actually need for the various different aspects. But what we do know is your body will use what it needs, and any excess will probably be voided.
Okay, cool. Right, now finally, I think we've probably exhausted everything in here. I want to see how this actually works on us as humans when it comes to our recovery. So I gather we're going to another lab.
Yep, let's head to the physiology lab and see how it actually works.
Cool. So we've come into the physiology lab, which looks a bit intimidating, and to me a treadmill means pain, but how do we actually, or how have you gone about finding out what polyphenols do when it comes to recovery in the body?
Okay, so this is where the scientific bit happens. So first and foremost, we have to take baseline measures, and we group these into 3 areas. So the first one is your bloods. So these are the objective markers. So we measure things like creatine kinase, which is a marker of muscle damage. Okay. We measure inflammation. So we use something called C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation. And then the second component is subjective markers. So we measure how sore you are, what's your muscle soreness like. And then we do muscle function. So muscle function is how much power can your muscles produce. And these 3 tell us a story about where you are at baseline. Then the next part is we get you to the exercise, the hard exercise.
Okay.
And one model to do that is brick training sessions. So this is where you do 20 minutes of, time trialing on a bike. Then you do a 10-minute max run. You get back on the bike and you keep repeating that process, and that creates a lot of muscle damage.
Yeah, so tell us about it. I think most people know that.
Yeah, so that's the damaging protocol. So we do that to damage your muscle. So once we've measured your baseline markers of your soreness, your muscle function and your bloods, we then do the damage, and then we measure it again straight after exercise, 24 hours after exercise, and 48 hours after exercise. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to put a trace on how quickly are you recovering on these various different components. And we've actually found that when you take polyphenols, around 1,000 milligrams of polyphenols a day.
Which is about 5 handfuls of blueberries.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm
learning.
And when you take that recovery of 1,000 milligrams of polyphenols, we found that it helps accelerate recovery. So some people feel less sore, some people's muscle function gets rescued quicker. And this basically shows that, say you have a race on a weekend, and then you've got another race on the following weekend, actually taking polyphenols at 1,000 milligrams a day before and after for several days can actually accelerate your recovery so that you're fresher and more prepared for your next race.
So does that mean if I had a glass of wine straight after my race, it's going to help my recovery?
Right, now whilst wine contains polyphenols, I'm not quite sure that's an adequate recovery strategy.
I'll stick with the coffee and the blueberries. Well, we've been delving into polyphenols so much, but how do they even become a kind of topic of research or conversation? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so polyphenols have been around for a long time.
Of course, they have, yeah.
But in terms of research, the nutrition research has really been focused on the health and well-being of polyphenols, especially around cardiovascular health and the effects of polyphenols on blood pressure. But like anything, if it has an effect on health, it's probably going to have an effect on sports and exercise performance. So emerging evidence quite a few years ago found that polyphenols could help accelerate recovery, but we didn't quite know what the mechanisms were. So this is a really growing body this is a growing area in sports nutrition where we want to know more about what polyphenols can do and how they work. And I think nutrition's full of supplements, isn't it? We take protein powders, we take vitamins, there's so many supplements out there. But the polyphenol story is a food first. So polyphenols are found in foods. So if you can incorporate that within your diet without having to take additional supplements, it's a nice way of enhancing your recovery.
Yeah, 100%. And talking of which, a lovely segue, I think it's time to head to the kitchen because you promised me some food at the end of this.
Let's do it.
Cool. All right, well, we've done enough talking about the food. I think it's time to actually sample some of these polyphenols for real, because it can't be a GTN video without me getting some food in. But a final couple of questions, Mayur. How soon, is that window for getting your recovery food in after training? Because I know there's sort of the 30-minute numbers been talked about before.
Yeah, I think it depends how often you train. So a lot of triathletes and cyclists tend to do multiple sessions in a day. So the rule of thumb really is try and get your recovery as soon as you can. Okay. And a recovery shake is usually a great way of doing it because you've got the fluids, help with your hydration, and then you can get your macros in there so you can, change your protein and carbohydrate content depending on what you've done and what you've got coming up.
Okay, so on that topic actually, obviously we've been focusing on polyphenols and all these bright coloured foods, but very quickly, the macros, when you're looking at recovery, what should that ratio be between carbohydrates and proteins and fats? Yeah,
good question. So again, it depends. The rule of thumb usually is 30 grams of protein. You should really try and get that in your recovery as soon as possible. And then the carbohydrate depends. So I guess you've got to ask yourself the question, after my shake, am I going to eat a big meal? Have I not got a large window to get the fuel in to then get my next training session, in which case your recovery shake wants to have more carbohydrate. But if you're going to have your meal pretty soon after, then your shake can be a lot lighter in the carbohydrate department. Okay, so rather than a ratio, think of protein first and then the rest depends on what's coming up, really. Exactly, yeah, and this is food first approach as well. So there might be scenarios where you might be able to access food straight away. So in those scenarios, you might not need a shake. If you can access good quality food immediately after your training session, then that can help you refuel. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And obviously we've been delving into these polyphenols and we've got the good green vitality here and then we've got all these lovely fruits. Can I overdose on it if I added the new zest and I had all these delicious fruits? Could that do me any damage? Is there any harm of doing too much in the way of polyphenols? Or yeah, it's an interesting question. I get asked this a lot actually, and not just me being weird, and not just about polyphenols. So, can too much of anything be bad? And it's about a balance, isn't it? If you overconsume protein, then you're going to neglect some of the other nutrients. Yeah. If you overconsume carbohydrate or fat, even some vitamins, and I think polyphenols sits in that same sort of category where some is good, a bit more is better. But then you reach this point of, once you get to around 1,000 milligrams of polyphenols per day. Okay. So that's taking the equivalent of, say, a large handful of blueberries, sort of 3 or 4 times a day. You reach this point where you've taken enough, but by having more, you're not actually getting any benefits. Yeah. So do we want to be adding the GGV into this, or is our smoothie going to have enough on its own in this situation? Yeah, so rule of thumb is in any recovery shake, if you're making a shake, you want to have around 300 to 400 milligrams of polyphenols. So you'd have to have a pretty large punnet of blueberries to get that amount. So if you put a scoop of the GGV, handful of blueberries, handful of raspberries, and then whatever milk and yogurt you want to put in there, you're getting that 300 to 400 milligram mark of polyphenols. Cool. Sounds yummy. I think we should get making.
Well, you know I love it when I get to eat on the job, but in all honesty, the best part of today has been the learning, thanks to Mayur. I found this fascinating, and as you guys know, recovery really is quite a skill and something you need to prioritise, and food plays a massive part in that. So a massive thank you to you. Cheers.
Cheers. Enjoy.
Yeah, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Give us a like and hit the subscribe button.